Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon. It is November 5, 2021. This is a special meeting of the Steering Committee of the Vermont Climate Council. We have a light agenda today. I believe I haven't looked at the most recent draft, but I think it was to approve the minutes of the last meeting and then to have a discussion about the climate action plan at the request, I think, of first Chris, and then Lauren and Liz felt it would be a good conversation to have this afternoon. So yes, it was, I got to get this thing off my screen that says got it. So without further ado, I think we can turn it back to you, David, and get the minutes approved. And then I guess I would recommend we open it up to Chris to talk about his idea and his proposal and have a good discussion around it.
Great. Thanks, Secretary Young, and welcome everybody. Okay, so I don't think we're going to be able to do the minutes because the link isn't working. Oh, I guess it is now. But
I put a new link in the chat. It's obviously last minute for folks to review.
Kind of last minute. I feel a little bit odd doing it. It's not urgent. I would suggest we do that next time we get together. That's okay with folks. Just give people time to read it properly. Yeah. Okay. So this is spurred by Chris's thoughtful email about us in our final 3 weeks of process to get this out. What is it going to take from the council standpoint to do it? So Chris, I do think it would be helpful if you want to put some ideas on the table on the basis of that email you sent around. The one thing I will say before is I think there's 3 things that kind of come together in this conversation. One is how much time, like physical time, does the council need to do this work, right? The second related piece is what is the level of detail and content that we're really going to be able to aim for December 1st, right? So let's get that super clear, particularly for everybody who's spending time writing right now. So everybody gets some clear guidance. And the third piece is as clear as we can say of the next steps after December 1st. Like, is there going to be some sort of new version of this in March? If not, like, what's the plan, right? So I think those 3 things come together in this conversation. And I'll just put those out there. Chris, let me turn it over to you, though, because this, I think you put some really sensible thoughts down in that email.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm not used to doing this from the car on the phone, so sorry about that.
Yeah.
We're saying sorry I was late. We have a town, an unorganized town in our region is questioning whether or not they should have to pay for fire and rescue. So we're having that conversation. Yeah, I was just reflecting on the last meeting that we had, and we did make some good progress, but it also was noted during the meeting, a number of people commented, it's great that we're finally having these conversations around the policy. And there were also some comments made like, well, we made it through that one, but we haven't really started making decisions yet. And I'm just basing this on my, years of experience in planning. Where we're at now is not unusual, where we're kind of coming to the conclusion of a process and people are starting to engage probably more deeply than they have, in these larger conversations. And sometimes it even happens, and I'm not saying this is necessarily happening, I'm just reflecting on my experience with other planning efforts. People start really reflecting on the gravitas of what you've been asked to do, and once they start seeing it more in writing, asking the details about what the impacts are that we're being asked to do, or the details of how it's going to be implemented. And we've been tasked by the legislature with a lot of different functions. So the reason I raised my concern was, we're concluding a week. We've got functionally, really, I would say 2.5 weeks left. Because we've got Thanksgiving week is that 3rd week. I know that, and there had been discussion about, having a pretty substantial meeting on the 23rd. But, depending on what happens at that meeting, if you've got a lot you've got to deal with, I don't think you're bringing people back on Thanksgiving or Friday or Saturday or Sunday thereafter. And then you've got, 3 business days after that to be done. I say we have, And so my concern was, how are we going to get through agreement on all of these issues that we still have before us? And it may be easy to find consensus on some of those. There may still be a lot of questions on a lot of these items. And so what I had proposed was, I wasn't trying to suggest just upend everything and throw the baby out with the bathwater. What I was trying to suggest was it may be that we need to just on some of these items start looking at really having up and down votes on, is it in the plan and adopted as a part of the plan, or is it as an item, an action item in the plan, but not quite adopted because more information is necessary before the council can fully commit to it? Or third, can it not be included in the plan because there's just not enough agreement around it? And that also then brought to mind, how many more meetings are we really talking about? And I mean, some of this to my mind is almost an exercise of looking at how many action items do we have? How much time do we need to assign to those action items? What's that going to take? Because even this last meeting, we were involved in this, heavy substance of the greenhouse gas emissions reductions pathways. And, we're starting to, understandably so, need to limit conversation about that, but there's still a lot of conversation yet to be had. So I'm just trying to figure out, David, I think you framed it well. There's literally how much time do we need relative to how much time do we have? What are the implications then for the drafting process? Because we're concurrently trying to make decisions while we're also drafting the plan. And then the other piece that I was just, I think we focused a lot on the actions right now, but there are the other pieces related to funding and financing options. I know Jane's got a lot on her plate around this. Legislative action and rulemaking, council next steps, technical analyses, next steps. So in addition to all the other actions coming out of the subject, we got all that stuff too. So that was why my email, why I suggested we have a meeting to have a discussion about what to do. I'm not claiming to have a magic solution. And maybe other folks don't necessarily share my concerns, but that was where that came from.
Thanks, Chris. Jared, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just really want to thank Chris and really respect where you're coming from, Chris, because what I hear you saying is, you are really taking seriously the gravity of the responsibility that we all have in terms of feeling of confidence on what we're voting on and meeting both our legal and just like our civic and moral responsibilities as people who've been entrusted with this. I just want to say up front that I am personally, I can't speak for others, I can just speak for myself. I am personally willing to meet more, I'm willing to meet longer, I'm willing to do whatever is needed so that folks can have the confidence that they need and that the questions get answered. I do want to offer an update because I know some folks on this call were not at the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee meeting yesterday. I see Peter, co-chair of that committee, is on. So Peter, I invite you to add anything here, but I think one thing that's important for everyone here to know is that we did agree to a process by which, and Liz was as well, of course, that all of the questions that came in via the survey are going to be responded to kind of in writing, transparently in a table that both those question askers and anybody else who wants to see that information will be able to see. And the deadline for that is end of day next Monday, so that counselors who raised those questions will be able to see those responses in hopes that that'll help, lend some efficiency to the process, because some of them are just clarifying questions that can just be answered in writing and we don't necessarily need to take the time of the entire council to address. I do want to say though, and maybe first I want to make sure I'm understanding your proposal, Chris, and not responding to something that I think it is when you're actually intending something different. As I read it, I did have a couple of concerns that I do also want to get on the table. And those are actually three: around efficiency, around how they relate to our already agreed upon decision-making process, and how they would potentially relate to our ability to, I just want to set some context of my understanding. I trust that I speak for the rest of the cross-sector committee about what was intended with our set of recommendations and how they work together as a group to give us confidence that that set of recommendations together can meet the requirements and the implications of, if any one of those are taken out, a reassessment that would be needed or something else that would need to be offered in its stead to make sure that we still have confidence that altogether as a package, those recommendations would add up to meeting in this case, the legally binding emissions reduction requirement. So on the efficiency piece and on the kind of decision-making process piece, my recollection, and I would defer to others, including Jane and David, but really anyone on the steering committee who agreed to this already, my understanding was what we had agreed to was that the recommendations that came forward, certainly from, let's say in this case in the cross-sector committee, but I think this applies to the other subcommittee, there is an assumption that those would be in the plan and would be moved forward unless a concern is raised about a specific piece and somebody wants to raise that for discussion and or eventually raise it for a vote. I may have misread you, Chris, but I think I heard you say that you want to go through piece by piece every single recommendation of the cross-sector committee. I don't know if you mean it to apply to the other committees and vote each one up or down. Okay, I'm glad to see you shaking your head no, because I think we should only do that for the ones where people are raising concerns, both from an efficiency standpoint and from a just kind of respecting the decision-making process. Okay, great. I'm glad we're on the same page there. The last thing is I really want to convey that certainly as somebody who, and I know others are trying to do this because we all take seriously our responsibility to put forward a plan that meets the legal requirements. One of the things I was doing as a cross-sector mitigation subcommittee member was saying over the last year, how do these all add up and to what degree of confidence can we have in them? And a lot of them are really interconnected. You know, the heat pumps goal is connected to the weatherization goal. The EV supply equipment and charging infrastructure goal is connected to the transportation and climate initiative, which is connected to the California Clean Cars 2 piece. And so I just want to be clear that, like, if I don't think people should see what's coming out, the consensus recommendations coming out of the entire cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. I do not see those as a menu of options where we can say yes to this, no to this, because as soon as we say no to something, it gives us a deficit in terms of our ability to meet the emissions reduction requirements. So I really appreciate that you use that phrase gravity, Chris, because I think that, to me, part of the gravity of this process is it's not enough to just say no to something, because we're also going to have to say yes to something else that would be able to do the equivalent amount to get us back to a plan that we can have confidence would meet the requirements. So those are just some initial thoughts that I wanted to offer, but I appreciate what you put forward, Chris, and I'm looking forward to further discussion.
Thanks, Jared. Okay, great. Liz?
Yeah, the thing that I wanted to add to the conversation is in responding to Chris's initial thoughts on this, and in the cross-sector subcommittee yesterday, it occurred to me that one of the ways, maybe the initial way we should handle both the concerns that have been raised as well as the way to get to the maximum amount of consensus possible is to ask the drafters of all sections, including the committees coming up, the subcommittees coming up, to really think very carefully about how they're drafting what it is the council is being asked to adopt, because there are, I think, some natural buckets that Chris has identified in the first two bullets or points in Chris's proposal. Is really, there are some things that there's wide consensus on that could and should and will move forward, but then there are other things that I think we as a council should acknowledge need further work and still adopt them, but adopt them with that framework. And so I think that's the point at which maybe some greater clarification around writing should happen. We saw that with a couple of the proposals cross-sector had, and I'd put even a really critical proposal for meeting the goal, such as the clean heat standard, in that bucket, where the drafting itself is acknowledging the further work that needs to happen, and even the further complexities around how the policy is framed, that I don't think any counselor should feel when they vote yes for that proposal, that they are voting yes for specific detailed line items of how that's going to be adopted at the legislature. I don't think that's what we should be asked to do, and I don't understand that that's what we are being asked to do.
Agreed.
So yeah, so making sure that's clear in the drafting, I think, would really, really help. And that's where it might be important for our gatekeepers, which include Jane and Marion, of course, as well as other counselors who are looking at drafts, to really keep that in mind as we're reviewing, because I think it will really help get us across the finish line.
Thanks, Liz. That sounds really helpful. And that speaks to sort of what I was saying, the second related piece of, what exactly are we agreeing to, and what is the altitude of that? And if it needs to say explicitly, we agree to this, and we have all these questions about implementation, right? Okay. All right. So we haven't totally dealt with all, like, do we need more time? As Chris says, how are we going to get more time? Liz puts out a really great framework for this middle piece about the saying exactly what we're asking the council to agree to, and avoiding getting into a level of detail that gets further than we want to get right now. Chris, you want to help out?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're fine.
I'm getting, sorry, I get all kinds of weird stuff when I touch my phone. So we're having now the conversation I wanted to have. So this is great. The other piece of this I think is critical is we not only do we need to identify what kind of time we're going to need. Like, I know in my own life, I'm having to put off, I don't know when I can interview planners to hire, because I am trying, because I'm taking this seriously. I'm not sure I know what our schedule is, but I don't know what it really is going to wind up needing to be. And so for all of us, I think we need to kind of nail down very quickly, if we are going to have more meetings, do that very quickly, not kind of a wait and see. I'm not saying anybody suggested a wait and see. I'm just saying, to the extent that anybody's kind of putting things on hold in anticipation of maybe needing to give this more time, we need to nail down some specifics. And then, if by golly, if we wind up having found time, that's awesome. But so I just wanted to, I guess that's kind of another fourth piece, is just so all of us on the council have some predictability over these next couple of weeks.
Well, why don't we talk specifically about that right now? And that's time. Right now, there's a couple of things that Jane and Mary and I have talked about. One is we already, for the November 16th meeting, have blocked agendas to 6 p.m. And we could do something similar for next week, or block it to 5 or 5:30 or something like that. So we could extend the ones we have. There's also the ability to grab a Wednesday morning that Jane and I talked about, whether that's next week. But no, that would have to be next week or the following week. So those are opportunities to, like, grab blocks of time and put it on the council's schedule right now. Secretary Young?
I'm feeling like we've jumped from timing without finishing the prior conversation,
Okay.
because I think that really drives a timing conversation, which a lot of people had concerns on. Counselors had a concern with extending time of day earlier this week. And so I think we have to be very mindful that we just can't extend people's calendars to 6 or 7. I did not hear a great consensus around that on Tuesday. But before we get there, I mean, I've heard Chris suggest that we adopt a construct, which I totally agree that we need, with Liz and others, that we need more information written in plain English. This is a plan, I think, that the public is going to be reading. And I'm not an expert in all of this, but I read through it, and I'm not quite sure what the recommendations mean in the big picture, what their impacts are going to be, who's going to pay, who's the winner, who's the loser. And so if we can get draft plans that basically outline, we recommend, the recommendation is we adopt the California rule, whatever. I have no idea what that means for Vermont. I have a sense that it could mean litigation, because I was very much involved in litigation a number of years ago when the first California rule was adopted. Is it going to be enough of a benefit to Vermont right now to move into a litigation mode if that's what we think will happen? I mean, there's just, every one of these has an impact, and it's not diving into necessarily the minutia of it, Jared. I would submit it's it's at least explaining why we think this is going to help us achieve our goal. And if there are downsides, what those are, and if there are upsides, what those are. And then I agree with Chris totally that we could break this down into the pieces. At least I've looked at cross-sector mitigation with Chris's, kind of construct in mind. We can find some ideas in there, and or they're not just ideas, but some recommendations. I think there'll be consensus, and we can put those in the initial. We've always agreed it's going to be an initial plan, and it's going to be iterative, and we're going to have to add to it. Not every 4 years, but maybe every 6 months, who knows, as things change and as we get the information we need to make decisions. So I think that we could be mindful in our conversations about where we think there's consensus, what should go in the first initial CAP plan, what we can put out for public comment while we're working on those areas where counselors feel they don't even have enough information to say, yes, this should be in the plan. So Chris, you've said, yes, this should be in the plan and we need for more information, but I think you're going to hit counselors who are going to say, I can't agree to put this in the plan because I don't have enough information to agree to that. And then I'll throw this out there. I don't think we need to talk about financing. We should have maybe a section on potential areas of financing, but until we know what we're financing, it's going to really be difficult to really do justice to the financing in this draft. I mean, it's not this initial CAP plan. We've called it an initial plan. We've told the legislature it's going to be iterative. We're going to continue to work on it. Otherwise, I think that's what I hear you saying, Chris. And I would just suggest that we can't not put things in. I think we should put things on a list to be further analyzed and reviewed and explained to the council after December 1, if we don't have time to get everybody to a comfort level on every item that's being recommended.
Okay. Thanks, Secretary Young. Chris?
Yeah, sorry, I went to some weird safe driving mode and everybody disappeared, so I had to hop off for a second. I'm not moving. Secretary Young, you're right. That's what struck me about what I was hearing in the conversation at full council last time we met, that I don't like Jared. I'm glad the characterization you just gave about, all these pieces having to hang together. Otherwise you have to find other pieces. I'm not sure everybody understood that, but I think frankly, understanding that's going to prompt a lot more conversation along the lines of what Secretary Young just said. And I don't know. I mean, honestly, I don't know if that's good, if we're going to get that done by the deadline. I'm not saying we're not. I'm not saying I'm going to be. I'm not proposing any obstructionism or anything. I'm just thinking, just given the seriousness of what people are going to take it, the nature of the conversations that are going to happen. Will we be able to do that? I don't know. And that's why I was, previously suggested the plan B. I guess now we're having the conversation about, how do we move the conversation along to the extent that we can, find agreement where we can, identify what work we have yet to do, just to try to meet that deadline, that very real deadline that we've got, so that we have, as much as we can possibly and reasonably have, given the limitations that we've got. So I'm not trying to be a nattering nabob of negativism at all. Just realistically, just having been in lots of these conversations over the years, I just kind of see a trajectory of there still being a lot of questions. And the other piece of this too is when this goes to the public, we have to be able to explain what the implications are of every decision that we make. If we don't know the answers, and I would also say go to the public with a lot of humility that there are some answers we're not going to know. But impacts on jobs, impact on costs, impacts. There's the whole just transitions piece. I just think we're going to have to approach this with some humility too about how much we know, how much we don't know. But we're gonna have to be really clear on understanding what the implications are across all these things that the legislatures asked us to identify.
Thanks, Chris. And just quick before I jump to Secretary Moore, I think one of the things that gets confusing is whether, as we are recognizing we just can't get to a level of detail by December 1 and have everybody on board, sort of what Liz was trying to say. What I don't think Liz was saying was, therefore, let's leave a bunch of stuff out. I think is what you're saying is, this as an idea, we're going to stand behind. We know there's a lot of detail that would need to be sorted out so that it actually is a good idea. So I want to sort of distinguish between this idea of ideas get left out because we're not comfortable versus they get left in, but with all the caveats saying there's a lot of detail and relevant detail here that we simply haven't gotten to yet.
Well, David, just, oh, I'm sorry, just real quick on that, because that's a critical point. And I guess my response to that is, I have no idea how the council feels about what you just said.
Right.
I mean, it's us as a steering committee agreeing with each other about what ideally would happen, but you know, I was seeing a lot of concerns about what was presented, and that's why again, my opinion about, you know, what was proposed has nothing to do with this. I was just watching the conversation, and a lot of people saying, I cannot agree to that until I see yada yada yada. And then, you know, Jared saying, well, all these pieces need to hang together, which just throws up a lot of red flags to me about, okay, from a process perspective, what is it that we can reasonably produce in this time? And so that's so I think ideally, David, that would happen. I think when we have the conversation with the council, I'm not sure what can happen.
Yeah, fair enough. Secretary Moore?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of things. One is just what I see is the critical importance of adopting an action plan by December 1st. I'm going to say, regardless of the adequacy of the plan, I don't think that's actually, I don't want that to be misinterpreted or misconstrued. But to the extent the council doesn't act by December 1st, it appears the Global Warming Solutions Act would then tell the agency that it needs to step in and pursue all of the necessary reductions through rulemaking. I would hope none of us think that that is an ideal solution. And so we need to have a construct that has the council adopt a document. I just want to say that, to my mind, that's an overarching or overriding need, and we should be working towards that. And then I think there's a lot of space by probably what's required by the Global Warming Solutions Act to achieve the reduction requirements and what may be ready for implementation. And really liked the frame Liz brought to that, just saying that there are probably some of each. The other piece is, frankly, the legislature is going to have finite capacity for what it's able to work on this session. And we need some way of, I think, indicating to them what our priorities are for action. And it may be more by default than we would like, in that it may be that there's a subset that's clearly ready, and there may be some really important things that aren't. But just I appreciate the framing Liz brought forward, and I think there's a way to do it that sort of also meets the concerns I've heard Jared express about trying to give a sense of the overall package, and at the same time indicate not all of these ideas are equally ready.
Thanks, Julie. Lauren?
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge support for Chris's proposal, especially with Liz's friendly amendment or framing. I appreciate, Jared, that cross-sector mitigation yesterday met and discussed an opportunity to provide more clarity around those issue areas that we either didn't get to or didn't resolve at council. And I can't speak for the full subcommittee of Ag and Ecosystems nor Rural Resilience and Adaptation, but I think as the only steering committee member who is not in cross-sector mitigation or is in one of the other subcommittees that is creating actions, we'll have a week less to be able to do the same thing. And so I just want to acknowledge, if there is as much concern and or clarity needed around those actions that we've created, there will be, 7 days isn't that much time necessarily, but it is when we're talking in terms of a half month. So we might not have the same time afforded to us to come up with the same level of clarity or detail around it. which is why I really appreciate Chris's one of the categories, which I've been calling like provisional inclusion. Those issue areas or actions that still require a little bit more clarity or discourse, whether it's at the subcommittee level or the full council level, that there's general consensus around it, but that some of the details still need to be fleshed out, and to acknowledge that in the plan. I think that also gives us an idea of what we can be working on after December 1st, since we're all very hyper focused on how in the world we're going to get to December 1st, but what comes after that, I think, is something that we should start thinking about. And then I also want to acknowledge and appreciate two things that Jared said. First, to clarify that we're only talking about those issue areas that counselors have identified as needing more clarity around or are concerned to support, and not everything. We don't have time to get to everything, and I think if there's broad consensus or support, we should just move forward. That said, I think a lot of the issue areas are going to be in topics that are more controversial. A lot of the topics that we talked about on Tuesday at council, as well as anything that's more regulatory, but there are a lot of funding ideas that are coming out of a lot of the subcommittees, and we haven't really had the conversation yet about how we're going to fund and finance them. So even if all of those are going to get in because they're seen as relatively benign, we still haven't had that conversation yet of how we're going to decide what gets funded and what might not. And I think that's it. So thank you.
That's helpful. That's really helpful. Yeah, the provisional inclusion, that's an interesting construct, and whether it's labeled like that, Lauren, that could be interesting, or it's just the level of detail you get to that signals in the text, like we think this is where we're going, and we have these concerns that we want to look into going forward. Secretary Young?
I think Chris hit the nail on the head when he said he's not sure how the full council's going to feel about that piece, the provisional piece, that here's something we're backing, but we're going to dive into it and see, are we going to back off it if we dive into the details and say, this just isn't realistic, or this isn't work, or this is not ready for prime time? Or are you actually going to be asking council members to back something they don't have enough information to understand to back? And that's my fear, is that, you're not going to make progress where you could be making progress on some things where there's consensus and good detail and good reasoning behind it, but you're still pressuring counselors in a short period of time to actually unequivocally back something. And I know you're going to put a lot of caveats on it, but the way you present that, I think, is going to be I'm not sure how the counselors are going to feel about that. All the counselors. I didn't have a chance to put a lot of questions in the survey, and I just will say one last thing is, I don't think you can assume all the questions have been asked, and that by answering the survey questions and questions that there was time to raise at the last meeting are the end of the questions. I'm being realistic. So I'll leave it at that. I want to make progress, but it's a big group, and they're all taking it, to Jared's point, their responsibilities seriously. So the more they can be given up front, great, but there's still going to be debate and conversation that can't occur in writing, the way we've been doing it.
Okay. Liz?
Feels like there's an emerging distinction that I just want to try to articulate, and it's between recommendations that we should be asking as a council whether we back, recognizing that the design, that there's, if not infinite, many different designs within a particular idea that could come about. And I'll put in that bucket the 100% res that we've talked about as a council, where it seems like there's relatively strong consensus for the top line goal and recognition that there are several different ways to get there. So that might be a good example of a policy where the council could not just provisionally put it in, but put it in and say, the timing need not be soon, given what we've seen on the emissions pathway, and the design is important to study and get right. So we're not taking a position as a council on what that design needs to be, but we're endorsing the top level. Whereas what Secretary Young is talking about in this idea of provisional inclusion would be tougher because it seems like it would apply to policies where people are just uncertain about even the policy in the first place. And I do think that we could probably, parse it out now and have near consensus among this group, which policies things might fit in based upon the conversations we've had so far. So where that would leave us is, it feels like between now and December 1st, at least I would advocate that we try to get wide consensus and adoption on the things people, that are concrete and actionable now, as well as the things that from a policy point of view, counselors feel they can stand behind, even if they're acknowledging, and not just acknowledging, this is a level of detail question, David, you've said twice, less, it depends on the level of detail or have less detail. It's actually just the opposite. It's a clear statement of what we're adopting, with a clear statement that there are many pathways to get there and details that will have to be adopted thereafter that the council is not taking a position on. So getting those two buckets well defined and agreed to would be, I think, of significant achievement for December and really important to do, even if there's another group of policies where the council as a whole does not have a majority consensus to even move the policy forward, because there's more details we don't yet know or understand. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Liz. Chris?
Liz, that was great. And the only thing I was just going to note, just from a practical standpoint, is one of the reasons why I said what Lauren, I think it's a good term, called provisional. One of the reasons I proposed that is that gives people also an option, the easier option for people if they're feeling like perhaps comfortable but still don't know quite enough information, is to just vote no or say no. So I think that it gives us the option of moving more forward than otherwise we might be able to do.
So I'm trying to make sense of this, because I feel like, Liz, did I hear you right, Liz, that you were saying this provisional thing feels different than what you're talking about? Because what I heard you say is you need to have a very clear statement about what we're agreeing to, and a very clear statement about the kinds of details we're not agreeing to and we haven't figured out yet. And that's sort of what is needed for the key pieces of information in this December 1 plan.
Yeah, but to be clear, there might also be policies that we just can't get agreement on. So so there may still be a group of policies that either have the kind of unfortunate fate of getting voted out altogether if we follow the process we've already adopted to its conclusion, or could, because there's a trend toward understanding that it could be good to include, but a desire to know more before we actually stand behind it as a council, some bucket of provisionally included or included for further study, or however it gets denominated. But I do think that's distinct from the subset of policies that have strong and hopefully wide support on the council to move forward, understanding that there are policy pathways within it that could vary. And there's at least two that have come up. I mean, I think they both happen to be in cross sector because that's what we've gone through. But the clean heat standard is one and the res is the other. Both of those, if drafted well in the plan, would say why they will get us to the pathway emissions reductions, why they seem to be the right way to go. In the res case, we've already gone there and we need to strengthen it. Have the council stand behind those, and in that detail say, we are not taking a position as a council on the specific policy pathways beyond what we've just set up here, because it's a matter for further research or further legislative discussion, or there's not wide agreement on the council as to which exact pathway it needs to be. What we agree on is the top level. So there are other things that I have a feeling will be much more like what Chris and Lauren have described as provisional, because folks may not feel that they even have enough information to agree that the concept is the right one to include, to stand behind. We should be working toward adopting this. We just need to find the right policy framework to do it, or policy details to implement.
Got it. Okay, thanks, Liz. That's really helpful. Peter Walk, did you want to offer a comment here?
If I may, if it's okay with the steering committee, I would just say to Liz's point, I think those policies that you approve of to be part of the plan are all going to have further implications that others will have to grapple with, whoever is implementing, right? And so they're really, every single one has the sort of top line approval and then the implementation pieces where there will be disagreements outside of the council's work. So I think that's wise. I have concern about the provisional, sort of the term provisional, just from you are going to end up in a debate over which provisions you put on that provisional approval. And that is essentially the debate on the topic itself. And so I think it would be useful in some ways to suggest to the implementing bodies or the policy-making bodies in the legislature these are the things that we believe you need to address in this topic area. And that allows counselors to signal what they have concerns about without debating we only approve this if these things are included. And so that would be my recommendation to you as somebody who's dug into all of these details pretty significantly.
Thanks, Peter. Excuse me. Okay. So this is an opportunity for us to make a decision and provide some clarity. And it's interesting, Peter's word of caution there about this provisional piece and an encouragement to instead lift up what you can agree to and name all the other things that are concerning. I just want to circle back to Lauren and Chris on that. When you hear Peter's comment on that and Liz's way of describing, what do you think about the pathway forward? Lauren and Chris.
I guess my gut reaction concern would be, in the absence of acknowledging some good ideas where we ran out of time to discuss them as a council, and therefore they either weren't included or have been left off for a future iteration of the climate action plan. I think that will be more likely to occur to rural resilience and adaptation and agriculture and ecosystems recommendations, because we have less time to discuss them. So this week, we only got through one of 4 of the task groups from cross-sector, assuming we need to find more time to discuss the rest of those. There's just going to continue to be less time for 2 other subcommittees to acknowledge, defend, support their own ideas. And so in the absence of acknowledging that space to talk about any issues that other counselors might have who haven't been part of those respective subcommittees and their consensus process, I continue to be concerned that we'll be missing adaptation and resilience-based actions in the plan. So that's just a gut reaction to somewhat inequity in time to discuss the actions.
Okay. Jared?
Thanks. A couple of thoughts. One thing I'm thinking about is what is our reference point of kind of what's acceptable or what's needed. And I just want to go back to Julie's point for a second, because I think it's really important. And just speaking for myself, what I would say is it is untenable. It would be totally unacceptable not to pass a plan that meets the charge we were given by the legislature and that meets our legal requirements as I think most people see them. So what that means for me is we have had a cross-sector mitigation subcommittee that has done due diligence, deep research, dozens, scores of people and experts and stakeholders and community members over the last year that have put together a set of recommendations that have achieved consensus that I think our committee has strong confidence meets the emissions reduction requirements. So to me, that is the starting point. That is the baseline. And I just want to be really clear that if and when somebody raises a concern to say, take something out, there's also going to be a timing issue around how do we identify to put something back in? And so I hope that the reference point, the kind of default position is we need to pass a plan. Here's our starting point, not it's okay not to pass a plan. So let's just see which of the few things we can agree on and get to something that doesn't add up. I also think that it's really important. There's no one on this call now who I would address this to, but there are folks, there have been counselors who have raised questions in front of the full council that could have been asked if they read the materials beforehand. I think there's also a responsibility on all of us to do our due diligence and research, to read the CAP section drafts, to and carefully read them, so that what we're leaving council time for is areas where the drafts were not clear, which there are parts of, and where there are recommendations that are raising concerns once folks do understand the substance. So those are my thoughts for now.
Okay. Okay. All right. So I just want to keep us focused on what we need to do here, right? Which is to make a clear plan for the next 2.5 weeks or 3 weeks of how we're going to make this work. And we know we need to potentially get some more time on the books. We know we're trying to wrestle with what's the altitude and the right level of detail and the right sort of thing that we're approving on December 1. And we know we need to think about what comes next. Chris, I see your hand up, and I see Abby you want to get into. Chris, why don't you go first, and Abby?
Yeah, just I won't. I think everybody's touched on about every possible topic we could touch on this, and it's been a good discussion. The one point, Jared, I just want to note is because I know there are a lot of shoulds, including we should do what the legislature tasked us with doing, which is adopting a plan that includes the greenhouse gas targets. But the challenge with any kind of democratic body is there's also the option of not voting something out or not agreeing on something. And then we wind up in Secretary Moore's unfortunate, scenario of, okay, so then it goes to the agency. And I don't think anybody wants that. So it's just a reminder that there are a lot of shoulds. People should read the stuff ahead of time. They should read it in depth. I'll acknowledge that I got to the survey late. I was really concerned about a hard, I didn't know if there was a hard end at 12 noon for that last survey. So I did it at like 11:58 and answered what I could. So I'm just saying there's a lot of shoulds, but ultimately, if there is the option of not coming out of this thing with a plan. And I'm not saying I don't want that to happen. By God, we've put too much time and effort into this. But that's not up to us as a steering committee. That's ultimately up to each individual who serves on the council, what they want to do. And there's nobody, so I just wanted to raise that fear, frankly. It's not a possibility. It's a possibility and a fear.
Abby, how are you?
I am angry right now. I'm going to be very frank. Some of what I am hearing reflected right now is so one-sided and so unencompassing of the process, time, and effort that all of us have gone through that I am not even sure how to address it at this moment. The shoulds abound. I personally have sacrificed literal animal care to give time to this process. And I have not been able to read everything in great detail because of the demands that have been put on my time by this process, because it is deeply inequitable and has been handled so the entire time. I know, Jared, that you feel that cross-sector mitigation has held all kinds of space for all kinds of stakeholders. That is not true. I know it to not be true because I've talked to those people who do not feel that they have been held safely when they have spoken to people regarding their concerns, etc. I have raised concerns about this the entire time about the issues of equity alongside this process and have been pushed aside and ignored. And now we're here, and this is what happens. So the only way I'm going to agree to any plan is if it makes it very clear that the process by which it was accomplished was inequitable from the very beginning. Otherwise, I don't know how we would in good faith move forward. I don't want Julie to be put in the position of A&R having to make rules. That would throw all of our hard work and time under the bus. But I also think that it is imperative in this moment in our country, in our nation, in our state, that we acknowledge who has been left behind in this process. And that is a large number of people. And they are aware that they have been left behind. And to ignore that is at our ultimate peril and the peril of the legislature, frankly. I don't know where we go from there, but it had to be said.
So, all right. Jared, you got your hand up. I think what we need to do is consider what all of this means for the work ahead in the next few weeks, right? So Jared, go ahead.
I just want to say briefly, because I think it keeps coming up, justifiably so and importantly so. And I just want to say first, I hear you, I respect you, Abby. I think that in the charge we were given to deliver a plan in a year, there were certainly not the level of public engagement and outreach that we would have otherwise liked to have done. But I think I also want to pause to recognize and appreciate that while it's not perfect, while we could have done more, we also had 1,600 survey responses. We also had 4 in-person events with hundreds of people. We also had many webinars. I am personally not aware of, even if we think we could have and should have done better, and I agree with that, I also think that I'm not aware of any other state of Vermont process that has gotten more public engagement than the one this has. So I don't disagree with you, Abby, but I also am wondering what the alternative is with 1 month remaining, given the charge and the timeline that we were given. I also want at some point, I think it is important that folks know the process that cross-sector did go through, which was informed not just by those surveys, those in-person events, those webinar events, but also dozens and dozens of people and scores of people who joined in the public meetings that we had that were all publicly posted, and all of the task group outreach. It's been hundreds of people engaged. So, and representing low-income constituencies and communities of color and rural Vermonters. I'm not saying all of those folks have been involved. I don't think we can ever involve every single person in any public process, but I don't want there to be a sense that there wasn't an effort made and that we didn't do important and substantive public engagement. Could it have been better? Yes, but we did a lot, and I'm actually not aware of any other state of Vermont process that has done more.
Okay. I'm conscious of the time and know that this is a pretty powerful conversation. Secretary Young?
Perhaps I could be reminded by Jane and or Marion, and early on in this process, again, I go back to the conversations we had we were, we were pretty much advised on the first day, we needed more time. I think we agreed as a council, it would be an iterative process. I think we agreed to start the public engagement process without a plan, to get public input into what they would like to see in the plan. But we've not put the plan out for public comment or discussion. And my understanding was that was the next step. We were going to continue public engagement once we put out the initial plan, and it would be an iterative process, and we would go back and take that public engagement on specifics and see what we've got and see if we need to adjust based on the public comment. Did I misunderstand that from the get-go?
No, I mean, thank you for bringing that up, Secretary Young. We did have our public engagement events. They were very focused on the broad effects of climate change that people were seeing in their communities, as well as how they'd like to see themselves and us, the state, moving forward into solutions. Because at that point, that was where we were in the process, was transitioning from the what we needed to do to the how. We engaged with Vermonters around that, and we do have a component of our contract with them after December 1st to bring the plan back out to Vermonters, to work with partner organizations and continue on with public engagement. And we're working very closely now with them to refine what that public engagement plan between December 1st and March 1st will be specifically to bring to the council.
And I think adding to that, the council needs to make a decision when it wants to move in terms of updating its plan, doing that kind of thing. It could do that as soon as March, or it could do it at the end of next year. It can make a decision, right? And so if it takes its initial plan out and does engagement around it and hears things, that hearing will help the council whenever it's going to make its next move on this. Okay, so it's 5 o'clock on a Friday. We've had some pretty powerful conversations here. We still don't have an actual decision about what comes next. It sounds like we are close to being aligned around the idea of the specificity of what's being put in the document, in Secretary Young's words, in plain English, what it is we're asking counselors to agree to, what are the details that we're not able to agree on, or we don't have time to agree on, that are critically important. And we're just saying, we recognize these are important things, and those are the next things to either implementers or we and ourselves in updating our plan will agree to. So there's a clarity of message about what that is. I am unclear whether there is also going to be a bucket of ideas that get into that sort of provisional approval thing that we talked about. I don't know if that's there. You all can tell me. That seems important. And then we still haven't addressed the issue of time, just the time needed to have these conversations. Let's take the first thing first, which is, what is the instruction we should be giving to drafters right now in terms of how to articulate detail, and whether we want to make some sort of bucket of things that we know are just, we can't wrap our minds around them just yet, but we think they're important ideas. We just can't go there yet. Where are people on that?
I think personally, sorry, I think the most critical direction to drafters right now is what Liz said, which is really defining clearly the ask. I think that, I mean, and meanwhile, keep on doing what you were tasked with doing, recognizing that at some point there may have to come back and do some editing, before the final. But I think that piece that Liz has highlighted is critical, I think. Okay.
And Chris, what do you think about this other sort of potential bucket of things that would, either you call it provisional or something else? Is that something we want to lift up right now, or is that something you keep in your back pocket to say, all right, let's throw it into there?
I mean, I'm just looking at the limited amount of practically speaking, the limited amount of time that we have, because not everybody's gonna be able to stop their lives and meet for 4 days next week or something. So I'm kind of feeling like there has to be that other, that other bucket. I really appreciated the way that Peter described it. I know Lauren has concerns that the adaptation and resilience and agricultural ecosystems will get left behind. And Lauren, I would love to hear more on that. I'm not exactly sure how that happens, how that gets left out, because I actually thought some of those pieces are going to be easier to agree to. But I'm feeling like we need to make a decision to bring. We need to make a proposal to bring to the council pretty quickly. And if we can't do it today, I'm not trying to have us convene the steering committee, but if we can't do it tonight, we're going to have to come up with something for Tuesday, I think, for the council, because we're eating up time fast.
Yeah. Okay. I
don't know if what I said helped it or not, but
yeah. I see Jane making the point in the chat that drafting is happening, right? So and has happened, and there's documents out there. I wonder if that helps, though, in the discussion at the council level to say what we are asking for is this kind of approval, and what we recognize are details we can't agree to are these kinds of details, and that helps us in our conversation to clarify when we're going through it, for instance, next week with the two other subcommittees. Okay. We are past time, so please let me know if you're going to need to bail out, but I do think we need to try to land something here. Jane, you have your hand up.
I do just want to suggest that if there's consternation around the work of ag and eco and rural resilience not getting the time that they need or attention, I do think we could simply add the meeting that we had spoken to about Wednesday mornings and split up the work so that there is clarity and time to dive into each of them. And I feel like that's a simple fix. I don't feel like the week delay is really necessarily a problem. That CAP drafting guidance has given this clarity around the responsiveness survey from a few weeks ago now. So the expectation was that would be included after the meeting, provided to counselors to hopefully answer some of the simpler questions that we weren't able to get to in discussion, which I know is really important as well.
Okay. I don't think we've reached an agreement just yet on this sort of provisional idea. It's sort of hanging out there with concerns in the chat from Jared, and Peter put some concerns in there, but Liz, I think you've done such a good job of articulating this previously. Do you want to put something on the table specifically?
I do have two things that I'd be interested in putting on the table. One is, rather than just recognizing Jane's point in the chat that drafters are drafting, including, us, for that piece, if we could have a lot of clarity in the discussion, and David, as you try to drive toward consensus and understanding on what we're voting on, we need to have the ability in that discussion to say, I would vote for this, or I would be happy to support this if it said explicitly XYZ, and the XYZ in many cases is going to be just, again, using the example we already had of, rather than require, which was a word that was a hang up in the meeting we had last week, if it instead said explore and further study, or recommend to the legislature that they craft, or whatever it's going to be. It depends on the policy. Maybe that is, rather than to the drafters, just being very clear in the conversation that we're having as concerns develop, whether those concerns are because the draft is too is not something that they could support as framed because it's too declarative, or instead, even if it were redrafted, they would be unable to support it at this time, in which case it goes into this other discussion of it's either voted down or identified elsewhere on a list. That's one thing I would suggest. And the second thing is, I think we should just agree to have these additional meetings on Wednesday mornings. I think we should just do that. At worst, we end up not needing them, but
Right.
that feels unlikely.
Great. Okay. Okay. Does anybody have a concern doing exactly what Liz just put out there? Okay. And in terms of the extra meetings, we're talking about Wednesday the 17th we're talking about, or Wednesday the 10th? What are we talking about here? Sort of looking at Jane for a second. Because we could put in.
My expectation would be that based on this conversation, we should schedule them for both the 10th next Wednesday and the following Wednesday, the 17th, and hold them from 9 to 11. I don't think they should be as long as the Tuesday meetings, but those are the mornings. And the reason we've suggested Wednesday is there's the morning without any other subcommittee meeting or conflict.
Right.
It was also the second best time based on the last poll we did when we moved to Tuesdays for the council.
So the specific recommendation is on Wednesday the 10th and on Wednesday the 17th, do meetings from 9 to 11 to give the council more time to have its conversations. Secretary Young?
Just two things. I don't want to be, I mean, doesn't matter to me, I guess at this point. I don't want to be tone deaf, however, and I don't want Abby to feel like she hasn't been heard. And you're now, you know, and Chris to a certain degree as well. Folks are being asked now to spend more time in meetings around this. And, you know, I think you're just going to have to talk to the council about it on Tuesday. And then, you know, I think I saw that the meeting's time was changed on Tuesdays to 1 o'clock, and it was very specifically, you know, there are members of the executive branch that just don't have that time on Tuesday, and that's been a pretty clear time frame that we've tried to avoid. And in fact, we are cutting our obligations short on Tuesday to make the 1:30 meeting. I won't speak for the rest of the executive, but I'm just always surprised to see that time shift when we've been pretty clear about, you know, the other obligation we have that day until at least 1:30.
Yeah, I'll say that the one thing that was shifted was the 16th, which we had initially thought we might even do in person, and we had blocked off a bigger piece of time on the 16th. And that was what happened.
I would also just note, in case it becomes helpful, I do not believe, if the reason for that time is to avoid conflicts with other subcommittees, I do not believe there's a science and data subcommittee meeting on Wednesday afternoon, the 17th. And I think we will have largely finished our work kind of in support of the other subcommittees in the CAP section draft. So if it becomes necessary to find that time and that ends up being the only conflict, that might also become available. Just want to note that.
Thank you. Okay. So with Secretary Young's important caveat that we are asking for more time from counselors who are already feeling pretty maxed out. And I guess the other side of that coin is we really want to have the kinds of conversations we were having on Tuesday, right? We really want to get there. And that just requires some time. So let me just check though. Can we, for you as executive committee, can we move forward with the idea of blocking off those 2 Wednesday mornings and giving the signals as Liz has laid out about how we're going to focus ourselves and understand what we're agreeing to and what we're not trying to agree to? Those feel like the 2 pieces of agreement that we have here on this in your steering committee right now. Okay. So Any concerns with that for us moving forward? Obviously, the council can, well, we'll have to ask the council on Tuesday, make sure they're okay. If they say no, right? But as a proposal to the council, does this make sense? And we'll block the calendars and we'll write this up and we'll provide a little email memo to folks. This is what we talked about in the steering committee. This is how we're viewing this.
Just for the sake of the meetings, I think we should decide on the times and days now, so I can not wait till Tuesday to schedule them. And then the process, the proposal of how you're thinking and things will work, I think makes sense to review with the council on Tuesday.
Great.
So it looks like Secretary Moore has a conflict in the morning on the 17th. It sounds like there will not be a science and data meeting that afternoon. So my suggestion would be to hold the morning of the 10th and then 2 hours in the afternoon on the 17th is what I'm now proposing.
Yucks. Okay. All right. Everybody okay with that?
And those are two instances where I would be comfortable with the word provisional. We could always hope, knock on wood, that they may not be necessary if we are, depending on how we get through things in the next council meetings. But I think it is good to have them as a backup if absolutely needed.
Thanks. Before we end, we do like to give a moment for folks who've been observing our meeting. If there's any folks who want to provide some comment, if you've been an observer today and you want to weigh in, this is a good moment to do that. So I'll just create a pause for a second if anybody would like to make a comment who's been observing our meeting today. Okay. Okay. All right. Anything else before we wind up? So what you can expect is some blocks on your calendar, but equally important is an email with the framing that we talked about how we expect to be able to get to the right level of agreement over the next couple of weeks.
I just want to say thanks. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say thanks to everybody for willingness to meet and try to work this out.
Yeah, it's not easy. Okay. All righty then. We'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks,
Take
everybody.
care. Have a good weekend.
Good weekend.
All the best.
Did you see my chat, Jane? I was hoping it would reach you before we left.
Yes, it does.
But
it's okay. I don't know.
that's okay. The council meetings are more important than the steering meetings. And if we have to reschedule a steering meeting, that's easier than the full council meeting.
You really shouldn't need as many steering committees meetings anymore if you're meeting of the council every freaking day forever and ever and ever. Just saying.
Jane, you can also turn off the recording, I think, at this point.